Hello, everyone, and welcome. So great to see all of you. We have a lot of dinosaur enthusiasts, and our special guests from the Edelman Fossil Museum are here, which is exciting. um, so my name is Marina McDougall. I'm a senior curator here at the Academy, and tonight's program is Dinosaurs in Your Backyard, Hadrosaurus, foulkii, and other local marvels. It's remarkable to imagine that some 80 million years ago, duck-billed dinosaurs roamed the place where we live today. And that in 1858, just over the Benjamin Franklin Bridge in the town of Haddonfield, New Jersey, that the fossilized bones of one of these dinosaurs would be discovered by a farmer and unearthed to become the first dinosaur skeleton ever publicly displayed in the world, here in Philadelphia at the Academy. In a city celebrated for firsts, it's a pretty amazing first. Hadrosaurus foulkii, affectionately nicknamed Haddy by Academy staff, has recently been remounted and is now on public display in our dinosaur hall. Hopefully some of you got a glimpse of it tonight. We're delighted to celebrate with tonight's program in collaboration with WHYY's Mike and Scott, host and executive producer of The Pulse, a national weekly health and science show. Our special guests tonight, Dr. Bill Gallagher and Dr. Grace Gutchis, who both have special ties to the Academy, have unique insights to share, both in relation to our incredible local paleontological history, as well as the most current contemporary understanding of the lives of dinosaurs. And we're grateful to have both of them here tonight. We'd also like to thank Dr. Jason Downs, our VERT Paleo collection manager, Ned Gilmore, and our amazing educators, Liam, Amber, and David, for bringing out all of those incredible bones for you to look at tonight. So now I'd like to welcome Mike and Scott.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. We're excited to dig deeper into this topic. And to get us started, we thought it would make sense to have Bill do a little overview of all things that relate to this topic. So we're going to ask him to step up on stage first. Bill has many titles, but I think the most pertinent to our discussion tonight is that he's the author of a book called When Dinosaurs Roamed New Jersey. So Bill, go on up and tell us a little bit more, and then Grace and I will join you in a minute.
Okay, welcome everybody. Glad to be here. It's something of a homecoming for me, and I thank everybody who turned out tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the unexpected idea that dinosaurs were here in the Delaware Valley back in the Mesozoic era. First, we have to understand what a dinosaur is. This is probably the most important lesson of the night, and that is dinosaurs were invented as a concept. I mean, the bones were in the ground, and people probably made up myths about them, like giants and dragons. But it took a compilation of specimens in the south of England in the early 19th century, and their study by a very brilliant man, Sir Richard Owen, who founded the British Museum of Natural History. And he named the Dinosauria, which means terrible lizards, in 1842 from a few partial specimens. Without going too much into the details of anatomy, the basic idea was that these animals, which were mostly gigantic and terrifying, would have had a posture unlike modern reptiles. So at the top here we see a schematic showing the body of, say, a crocodile or a lizard, and the knees are bent at a 90-degree angle. This is the common sprawling posture that you see in all modern reptiles. Of course, you don't see it in snakes because they don't have any legs. But this is the kind of reptilian posture that he saw as different, from the dinosaur posture. And he compared the dinosaurs on the basis of their anatomy to mammals, having the legs in underneath the body in a so-called erect posture with straight limbs. And he had an outstanding sculptor and artist named Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins sculpt these dinosaurs as models because they didn't have enough bones to make a full skeleton yet. But they had enough to make a first attempt at trying to depict what they were. And he made these models for the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1853 in London. And they still stand in London today. This is Megalosaurus in the background. This is Iguanodon, which is one of the first dinosaur specimens to be named and described and figured. Here are Iguanodon teeth. At first, the scientists who studied these specimens thought that they were from a rhinoceros. So you can see that the dinosaur here is being reconstructed as a sort of giant, four-legged, quadrupedal reptilian rhinoceros. Well, where do we find dinosaurs? Most people think you have to go to some exotic place like the Gobi Desert or Patagonia. But the fact is that you just have to look in rocks of the right age, that is, of the Mesozoic era. And of course, that begins with the Triassic, and the next period is the Jurassic period, named after a successful Hollywood movie franchise, and the Cretaceous period, which is the last of the periods. And we are lucky here in this area to have deposits of Upper Cretaceous age. And here they are in the Marl Belt. And this is where marl mining took off in the 19th century. This is a big industry in southern New Jersey. And X marks the spot of Haddonfield, New Jersey, on the edge of the Marl Belt. Well, this is where the Hadrosaurus story begins, at Birdwood, the home of John Hopkins. It's a residence that was built in 1794. Hopkins was a direct lineal descendant of Elizabeth Haddon, and as such, Haddonfield. She was the one who founded Haddonfield. And as such, he had a very large farm in Haddonfield. And on this farm, he had marl deposits. So the story goes that one summer in 1858, William Parker Folk, a gentleman from Philadelphia and a member of this prestigious academy, was summering in Haddonfield, taking the country air, as it was called. And he became acquainted with John Hopkins. And at this house, probably, he learned that 20 years earlier, Hopkins, digging marl in a marl pit in a stream on the tributary of the Cooper River, had found a large pile of big, dark, heavy bones. Curiosity seekers came from all around to see the discovery, and some of them took some of the bones away. Well, Hopkins related this story to Folk. He became very excited and asked if he could reopen the marl pit and search for what remained of the bones. And Hopkins, with prompt liberality, in the Victorian phrase of the time, granted him permission, and he organized a group of marl diggers and dug 10 feet down from the top of the surface. The marl pit had slumped and grown over, and not 10 feet down, they found the big pile of dark, heavy bones. Well, you know, at this point, Folk knew that he needed help, so he sent for Joseph Leidy, the president of the Academy of Natural Sciences and the professor of anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania. He and Leidy were old friends through the academy. And Leidy dropped everything, and he brought Dr. Isaac Lee, a specialist in invertebrate paleontology, with him to the dock at the ferry landing in Philadelphia and took the ferry across the river to Camden, where Folk had a carriage, horse-drawn carriage, waiting for him to spirit him off down to this place. This is where Haddy came from in Haddonfield. This is the place I call, whoops, I have to go back. This is the place I call Haddonfield Run, and you can see the deposits of marl in the banks of the cliff today. So that's this dark gray stuff. Here it is. I chopped out a fresh surface. All these little white spots you see in here are actually fossil shells. This clay preserves things very, very well, and some very nice fossil shells came out of here. And I did some dating on these shells. My colleagues and I at Rutgers University subjected them to an analysis, and we found out this deposit's about 79 to 80 million years old as a result. And this is where they dug for the bones, into this marl deposit. And they found something like 49 bones and teeth, plus about a half a dozen miscellaneous chunks of unidentifiable bone. And here are some of the casts of that laid out. and identified on the table. And Leidy took these bones back to Philadelphia after spending the month of October digging them up, studied them for another month, and recognized that this was a giant herbivorous saurian of the type, the same nature as Iguanodon, one of the original Dinosauria that Owen studied. And he hypothesized that it could stand upright on its hind legs, making the dinosaur bipedal. Now, as we saw the original reconstructions of the Crystal Palace, they were all depicted as four-legged animals. But this was the first time somebody reared the dinosaur back up on its hind limbs. And the reason he thought that was because of the disparity in length of this bone, the femur or thigh bone, with the humerus, the bone of the upper arm. And he named the dinosaur after William Parker Foulkii, Hadrosaurus foulkii. The name means folk's bulky lizard, or folk's large lizard. Now, let's give this a try. Now it's not working.
Looks like you gotta click the mouse. There you go.
Okay.
The first slide.
Yeah. So the femur is the big bone in the middle. The humerus is that smaller bone down at the bottom. I like to call it the funny bone because it's your humerus. You know, you hit it. And that's the elbow joint right there. Whoops. That's the elbow joint right there. And that's the femur. That's the head of the femur. And you can see there's a disparity in length. It's almost twice as long as the humerus. And this was the basis for Leidy establishing that the animal could stand upright. He gave it a kangaroo-like posture. That's what he says in the original description. We wouldn't think of it so much that way today. So when Waterhouse Hawkins, who had designed the original Crystal Palace models, heard about this discovery, he sold everything, packed up his belongings, and took a ship to Philadelphia and begged Leidy to let him cast the fossil bones and make a reconstruction of the skeleton. And here is a picture of his studio, and it's interesting to note that the model he uses is a bird skeleton, an ostrich. And we'll see why that's important in a few moments. But you can see Hadrosaurus foulkii in the background here. So this is the first mount of a dinosaur skeleton in the Academy of Natural Sciences. This is one of these stereographic projection slides. And you can see that it's in this sort of tripodal position, mounted using its tail as a sort of prop and standing erect and sort of gobbling at a tree. Because the idea was that this would allow this animal to reach the higher vegetation unavailable to low-browsing dinosaurs, like the ankylosaurs, for example. So this was a very different view of the dinosaur at the time. Whoop. Well, reasons for the importance of Hadrosaurus foulkii. Time of its discovery, in 1858, the most complete dinosaur skeleton known on Earth. With 49 bones and teeth, they could make a reasonable skeleton out of it. And so it became the first skeleton mounted in a museum at the Academy of Natural Sciences in the old building at Broad and Sampson Street. And it created the first rush of dinomania. Many people came to see it. Leidy used the disparity in the length of the limb bones to suggest that dinosaurs could be bipedal, particularly Hadrosaurus. And it was used by T.H. Huxley and cited by him in his arguments for his hypothesis that there is an evolutionary ancestor-descendant relationship between dinosaurs and birds. The birds came from dinosaurs. In fact, in modern cladistic parlance, birds are dinosaurs. And it gave its name to a whole family, the Hadrosauridae, very diverse, very abundant, extremely successful group of dinosaurs, found all over Asia, North America, Europe, down into Patagonia, and even in Antarctica. And this was a very successful group of animals. It is the official New Jersey state dinosaur signed into law by Governor Jim Florio in June of 1991. I was there at the ceremony in the State House in... Yay, Jim. I was there at the State House when it happened. So we have our own dinosaur. Well, things didn't end there. They didn't end there, actually, because what happened was, oops, see if I can go forward, no, back. There we go. Here's the new reconstruction. This is the new mount. This is a picture, an old picture of the same kind of mount. The new reconstruction would have the dinosaur back down on 4 legs. But there's reason to believe that these animals could still get bipedal when they wanted to. And the reason for that is, I'll get used to this. The reason is because the center of gravity allows them to move around their hip structure. This was demonstrated by a British biophysicist in a great little book called Dynamics of Dinosaurs. And it's probable that they became bipedal when they needed to run, or perhaps when they wanted to get to the higher vegetation. And there must have been at least one occasion on which the male of the species might have assumed that position, but we won't go into that too much. So here is the modern statue of Hadrosaurus foulkii based on Critosaurus and Gryposaurus. These are flathead dinosaurs better known from full skeletons and skulls out in New Mexico and Alberta. So John Giannotti, the professor of art at Rutgers Camden University, put this skeleton together. He came up to Trenton to talk to me about it. We looked at our old 1930s mount of Hadrosaurus and noted how wrong it was and how we should change that. So this is what the result was, a more realistic pose for Hadrosaurus and more Romanesque profile. Oops, now what am I doing? Confangled mechanisms.
Just click wherever. Yep, there you go.
There we go. All right. This is what the Hadrosaurus site looks like today. There is a National Historic Landmark sign, and also the kids leave their plastic dinosaurs on the picnic table at the site as tribute to Hadrosaurus. It's very nice. Very nice. Whoa. Oh, all right. So, the story doesn't end there. As I said, later it goes on with Leidy Star student Edward Drinker Cope, a personal hero of mine, a precocious genius. He hung around the Academy halls when he was a child, making drawings of the fossils on exhibit there, published his first scientific paper at the age of 18, and went on to publish over 1,300 more scientific papers during his lifetime, naming hundreds and hundreds of new fossil creatures, not just dinosaurs, fossil mammals, fossil fishes, fossil amphibians, you name it. He studied in Europe conveniently during the Civil War because he was a Quaker, and his parents determined to send him off for the grand tour of Europe. And while there, he met another American named O.C. Marsh, who was also doing the grand tour. They became friends. He took up residence in Haddonfield, New Jersey, to be near the marl pits, and this was his house in Haddonfield, the sole surviving picture of it. It is now where City Hall in Haddonfield stands, but it was the finest house in Haddonfield and had a big barn out back where he kept his dinosaur bones. And there's Cope's first dinosaur bone, which was on exhibit. It's on exhibit out there. This is a partial hadrosaur femur from the West Jersey Marl Company pits, and here are the West Jersey Marl Company pits. This was an industrial operation. These marl mining pits became a major industrial operation. Now, Cope got most of his first dinosaur bones from there, and they came through Haddonfield and wound up here at the Academy of Natural Sciences until he showed his old pal from Europe, O.C. Marsh, around the marl pits. And while Cope was showing him the strata and the fossils, Marsh was familiarizing himself with the supervisor, the superintendent of marl mining, right there, standing like a giant among men, J.C. Voorhees. And the specimens that J.C. Voorhees had been sending to Haddonfield and thence to the Academy suddenly were making a right-hand turn and winding up in O.C. Marsh's museum, the Yale Peabody Museum in New Haven. That's why one of the best collections of New Jersey dinosaurs is up in New Haven, not in Philadelphia. So this started the Bone Wars, a tremendous rivalry between these two titans of 19th century paleontology. By the time they were done, there's vast new amounts of knowledge about any number of dinosaurs because the action moved out west. But basically, the take-home message that I want to leave you with is that for the last part of the 19th century, the Academy of Natural Sciences was one of the great centers in the world for the study of dinosaurs and other fossil vertebrates. Now, that kind of lapsed in the 20th century. And I'm really hoping that the Academy can establish the chair of paleontology here at the museum and bring back that grand tradition. Thank you.
All right. Come on up. All right, you're saying. So let's get a seat. Thank you so much for the introduction, Bill. That was excellent. And now take a seat, please, and turn on your microphone. There's a little button. And I want to remind all of you that you have little note cards on your seat. So if you have a question you want to ask of any of our experts, please write it down. Write it pretty big because my eyes are not what they used to be since I'm a dinosaur myself. So please write big and legibly, and we will fold your questions into the discussion. Thank you. So now I want to also welcome Grace Gatchis-Rohr to the stage, who is a paleontologist and a science educator. So Grace, do you want to add anything to what we've heard so far? What were some of Hadrosaurus' habits? What did they like? What were they like?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for allowing me to help educate all of you and obviously learn a little bit more about this amazing dinosaur first mounted in the world. So Hadrosaurus foulkii was part of, like Dr. Gallagher said, this group of dinosaurs that we call hadrosaurids. So these are our duck-billed dinosaurs. They were herbivorous dinosaurs that really took off in the Cretaceous period. So that's going to be that final period of what we call the Mesozoic, which is the age of the dinosaurs from around 252 million years ago till about 66 million years ago. And I think probably if you're in this room, you know how that ended with quite a big boom with the asteroid. So actually, when these animals were alive, it looked very different in New Jersey than what it does now. Obviously, we know Jersey is not underwater, but at the time, it actually was very close to the sea. The sea levels were a lot higher than they are today. Oxygen levels in the air were a lot higher, so temperatures were higher. The area and the plants that we had were very different. So flowering plants were just sort of coming onto the scene. They didn't appear until the Cretaceous, actually. So we see a lot of new flora that is coming and is influencing the evolution of some of these dinosaur groups that we're getting. And it's very interesting, we actually see these dinosaurs in like marl pits, like Dr. Gallagher was describing, because that is an indicator of a marine-like environment. So Hadrosaurus foulkii probably died close to the coast and then floated out to sea and was there fossilized.
Oh. And Bill, did they have any predators? So they looked pretty fierce themselves, but who were their enemies?
Well,
Use the microphone.
one candidate might have been.
Is it on?
I can break anything. This one candidate for a predator would have been Dryptosaurus, which was one of Cope's early discoveries, and that's an 18-foot-long tyrannosauroid. In fact, the first tyrannosauroid known from North America or anywhere else in the world. So it's a distant cousin of Tyrannosaurus rex, much smaller, but armed with a nasty, tearing claw, like this.
Oh.
So this is the claw in the hand of Dryptosaurus. This is in the collection of the Academy of Natural Sciences. It was one of the Cope specimens that he obtained from the marl pits. And he named it Laelaps, but Marsh, in one of the salvos of the Bone Wars, thoughtfully renamed it for him as Dryptosaurus. And there was taxonomic reasons dealing with Linnaean taxonomy, why he could get away with that. But this predator was 20 feet long and armed with these big claws.
Wow. Okay. So you said earlier that these were plant eaters. When paleontologists find something like this, how do they make that determination, Grace, that this was a plant eater and not a carnivore?
No, that's a great question. And a lot of what we base our knowledge on dinosaurs, about their behaviors and the types of diets that they had, is based on modern animals and their closest living relatives. So one of the best ways that you can look is at, one, their teeth. So if we look at the teeth of hadrosaurids, like Hadrosaurus foulkii, they've actually evolved to become what we call this dental battery. So it's this really packed sort of grinding surface of teeth here that are really good at processing plant material. And we see somewhat similarly evolved structures in herbivores today that would eat somewhat similar versus in a carnivore. You know, obviously we all know those giant teeth that T-Rex has. So that's a very good first indicator to tell what it might have been eating.
And Bill, do we know anything else? Did they live in herds? Did they like family life type things? Like what else can we deduce from what we know and found?
From work that's been done out in places like Montana and Alberta, we know that hadrosaurs nested in colonies and possibly raised their young in the nest. And they also maintained nest site fidelity. That means they came back to the same area to nest again and again. And big bone beds, sometimes stretching for miles, have been found loaded with just one species of hadrosaur. In the case of the Montana bone beds, the one big bone bed out there is Camposaurus bone bed, and that's near Choteau, Montana. That stretched for 1.5 miles and about 3/4 miles wide, containing the bones of thousands of hadrosaurs, one species. And the only other thing found in the way of dinosaurs in that layer were the shed teeth of raptors and tyrannosaurs. In Patagonia, there's a bone bed of hadrosaurs that stretches for 6 miles, indicating a huge herd of dinosaurs. So they did have complex behavioral, reproductive behavior and also colonial and herding behavior.
Do we know anything about what their color scheme was like? I mean, we tend to picture dinosaurs as sort of brown, greenish, maybe a little orange, but what else could we imagine here?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it was one that for a long time, you know, looking at the bones themselves, we couldn't tell soft tissues, that sort of thing. But there's been a lot of recent studies that have shown, especially in dinosaurs that were feathered, you can look at these structures. They're these little organelles called melanosomes. And if we look at the structure under a microscope, we can compare them to those same structures in modern bird feathers. And if we look at those same shapes, you can tell what type of pigment would be in those feathers. Was it more blackish? Was it reddish, brownish, that sort of thing? So we have all these amazing feathered dinosaur fossils, and then we can actually look and tell what colors they were as well. And it's a bit harder for these guys that weren't covered in feathers in the case of Hadrosaurus foulkii, but there's some new techniques that we're trying to look at. But we definitely can tell things like what they were covered in, for instance, because we get skin impressions of these scales. We can tell exactly what the scale shape was for these individuals.
So some of them must have looked really cool, I guess.
Definitely.
And Bill, in terms of, you know, when we have these finds, you've mentioned a bunch of finds out west where there was a lot of bones. What does it take to preserve those bones for generations to come? They are already very old when we get to them. So how do you preserve them in a museum like this one?
Well, it starts out in the field with carefully
Yeah.
plaster jacketing the bones for transport back to the museum. And then they have to be prepped in the prep lab where you take the plaster jacket off of the bones, protective encapsulating plaster, and then you carefully pick away the matrix that surrounds the fossil. And while you're doing this, you're injecting it with hardener, consolidant it's called, and various plastic compounds. And then you have to keep the bones in carefully controlled climatic conditions. There has to be low humidity, preferably about 40% humidity. You can't have too many temperature swings. In other words, you've got to have a really good HVAC system. And that will prevent things like pyrite disease. Pyrite disease is the decay of the bones from their internal chemical composition. Hadrosaurus would be a pile of white dust if it weren't properly conserved and kept under the proper conditions. Because what happens with pyrite disease is the fool's gold that's insinuated inside the bones as a result of the long geologic time of permineralization in the ground, that material interacts with moisture in the atmosphere to form a chemical process. It's a complicated series of steps, but the moisture in the atmosphere combines with the sulfur in the pyrite to make H2SO4, and that winds up, that's sulfuric acid, and that winds up converting some of the salts into a series of yellowish white powders. And we had a problem with this up in the New Jersey State Museum with some of our older specimens from the marl pits. They really had to be carefully conserved. One of the ways that you can do it is the old-fashioned way of dipping them in beeswax, which insinuates itself into all the remaining pores and coats the surface, essentially cuts off atmospheric penetration into the bone. And that old-fashioned way we found up in Trenton was the best way to do it.
Oh, really? Okay. So, Grace, what is some research that we can do nowadays with these bones and these collections that maybe we couldn't do even 25 years ago?
Yeah, I think paleontology, especially in the past few decades, has really kind of taken off in a bunch of different directions, where previously just using the bones to, describe them taxonomically is now giving way to molecular paleontology, where people are actually trying to do things like look at the feather color and potentially look at biomolecules that are inside. Like there's recent studies that have been shown that we can look at some of the biological waste products that are created through metabolism and actually be able to tell that a lot of the dinosaurs were warm-blooded, just like birds are today, rather than these cold-blooded lizards. We can use 3D modeling to actually scan the bones themselves and manipulate them in ways that show how these animals would have moved in life. So we're using these fossils to actually try and understand how these animals would have lived and interacted in their environments.
And what are some changes that you've observed over the course of your career, just in terms of what paleontologists can learn now, and what are some exciting new things that you've been able to do during your career?
CT scanning, one of the opportunities I had as a result of hosting the Great Russian Dinosaurs exhibit up in Trenton at the New Jersey State Museum. So I had an opportunity, with the permission of one of the Russian scientists, Tatiana Tumanova, to take the ankylosaur skulls off display and take them down to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, and we CT scanned them to look at their internal structure. So CT scanning, you may be familiar with. It's a medical kind of analysis in which X-rays are shot through your body and they bounce back, and a computer sort of integrates all of the data into a three-dimensional picture, which can be rotated, it can be cut in any cross-section you want. And one of the things we found out was that one of the dinosaurs, Tarkia, which is an Asian ankylosaur, had a tumor inside its sinus. And the tumor was connected to a hole in the skull. And the hole in the skull was about the diameter of a maxillary tooth of Tarbosaurus, which is an Asian variety of Tyrannosaur. So our working hypothesis, and we don't say that we have this definitively proven, but this dinosaur was attacked by a Tyrannosaur, beat him off with the club on its tail, and then lumbered off, and must have survived some period of time afterwards in order for the tumor to grow, essentially sealing off the hole in its skull. He couldn't have been a happy dinosaur, though.
So you can do like a medical history on some of these.
Yeah, and then I've been involved in a number of geochemical studies, REE studies, to determine whether or not bones have been reworked. It's a process of, say, burial, re-exhumation by erosion, transport down rivers, and reburied. And it's not such a good thing because you're only going to get fragmentary remains. This did not happen to Hadrosaurus because there was too much of it in one spot. But REEs can give you the history of the bones per mineralization. And REEs are also important because they're in your cell phone and all over your computer screens and in your electric motors and electric cars, but that's another story. Then the other thing that I've been involved in geochemical analysis was iridium spikes at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. And I worked with a team from Rutgers University. We drilled half a dozen different spots in New Jersey and found iridium excursions, orders of magnitude of enrichment of this rare metal, which is only found in concentrations in space rocks like meteorites and asteroids. And it's thought that this iridium, which was deposited in layers all around the Earth at the KT boundary 66 million years ago, is indicative of a large asteroid strike. And we found iridium excursions in 6 different localities in New Jersey, including Burlington County, Monmouth County, down in Sewell in the Edelman fossil pit. It wasn't called that then.
Yeah. If you have questions and you want to pass them on, please do, and somebody will collect them and then get them to me. Grace, we often think of paleontologists being out in the field, digging things up, finding things, but what does the day-to-day life look like of a paleontologist like you?
Although I wish that I could be out in the field every single day, that would be my dream. That's, obviously a very small portion of it. A lot of, sometimes paleontologists don't even do field work. There's a lot of different points that go into the discovery of the actual fossil itself, all the way to when it gets described and studied and used for research. And that involves, the fieldwork aspect of it, the preparation aspect of it. So that's a really big part of it, is the people who spend hours and hours working on actually opening up those jackets that we make in the field and prepping the fossils for long-term storage and research. And then finally, the actual, research that goes into it involves traveling to different museums. Sometimes, like with the work that I did, I traveled across many different museums, from the Museum of the Rockies in Montana to the Cincinnati Museum to even here, the American Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian, all that, specifically to look at their collections, because these museums really are libraries for further research for these organisms. There have been new publications that have come out on fossils that we've had for years in the collection. So there's all this new information really to be gleaned from these fossils themselves. So a lot of the day-to-day is, lots of reading papers. So if you want to be a paleontologist, I would say, brush up on your reading. That's a big thing. And then basically just being curious, wondering what the next question to ask is, sort of looking at all those different new avenues that are coming out, and whether it's CT technology or 3D modeling and that sort of thing. So
Lots of options. So we have about 20 minutes left, and I have a whole stack of questions here. So are you guys ready for this? We'll do, it's like speed dating. So first question comes from Rory, who is Haddy's friend, and asks, is Hadrosaurus a mom or a dad or a baby? Is it a girl or a boy?
I'm not going to touch that one.
No? We don't know?
No,
Okay. And we won't be able to know, right?
probably not.
Okay. So it is gender neutral.
Yeah, that's a
Okay.
good way. Yeah, we'll put it that way. There is some indication that Hadrosaurus may not be fully grown,
Oh,
the
okay.
specimen that's out there. And there are some enormous bones, in fact, some right in the Academy's collections, that indicate much larger individuals, maybe a third larger. So if Hadrosaurus is 25 feet long, There's a femur up in the Academy collection from Swedesboro, New Jersey, that indicates an animal maybe perhaps 33 feet long.
Wow, okay. So, who were Hadrosaurus's friends? Did they have friends? We talked about their enemies, but
Yeah, there were other like hadrosaurs that were living, other herbivorous dinosaurs that were living there at the time, and maybe you could even call some early mammals that were around. They were very small little guys, but you could say maybe they were friends.
okay. And what did they eat? I mean, we said they ate plants, but anything specific?
Well, the mummy up in the American Museum of Natural History. The mummy up in the American Museum of Natural History. Some of these hadrosaurs actually mummified. The skin became permineralized. The scenario is something like the carcass lays out during a drought, period of dryness, lays out in the sun, skin gets nice and sort of dinosaur jerky-like, and it gets buried quickly by the next rainy season's flood. And then it becomes, the skin itself becomes permineralized. And so there are a number of these dinosaur mummies, mostly hadrosaurs. And what they show is that you know, they contain the gut contents. And some of the plant material that's been found within these mummies include conifer needles and leaves and seeds of conifers. Well, where do seeds come? They come from pine cones. Imagine eating a pine cone. But they had these batteries of teeth, the hundreds of teeth within the jaws, and a sophisticated jaw mechanism which allowed shearing and chewing of the food. Very unusual for a reptile. Most reptiles just bolt their food, but Hadrosaurus was polite and he chewed his food before he swallowed it. And another specimen, I believe, has remains of berries in the stomach contents. So angiosperm plants, plants that are flowering plants and can produce fruits and berries, came on the scene earlier in the Cretaceous, and by the time of Hadrosaurus, they would have stretched out along all the river forests in South Jersey and elsewhere. And so Hadrosaurus might have had berries and fruits to eat.
We got a couple of questions about marl. What was it used for, and what do we know about it, and why don't we mine it in New Jersey anymore?
Well, marl in its classic English sense is any clay or fine-grained material with fossil shells in it. And of course, the Woodbury Formation fits that very nicely. But basically, it's marl is oftentimes very bioturbated, which means it's been dug through by marine animals, and so it's kind of mottled looking. And if you look at your L.L. Bean catalog, you'll see marl sweaters, and that's a good indication of what marl looks like. It's variegated and mottled, and it often has shellfish fossils in it. That provides a source of lime. The finer grained material, shell, clay, green sand marl, can also help loam up the soil. The green sand marl that was widely dug in South Jersey was used as a soil conditioner for long-term improvement of crop yield. And it may have been instrumental in giving New Jersey its name as the Garden State, because application of green sand improved the yield of the crops. Although today I think maybe we might call New Jersey the strip mall state.
So, Grace, this question is for you. Do you have a favorite place to dig for dinos in the US, or where you would like to dig for dinos?
That is a great question. So in general, the best place to look, despite there being dinosaurs obviously on both the East Coast and the West Coast, is typically the West Coast. The conditions in which when those animals died and the fossilization conditions there was the best, and so we get all of these really amazing specimens. That's where if you want to find a T-Rex, you go out west. If you want to find an Apatosaurus or a Diplodocus or, you know, any of the Triceratops, all those like really famous names, which a lot of those are buzzword names that were named by our friends Cope and Marsh during their infamous Bone Wars. So I would say I've been out to Montana, Wyoming, Utah before, so in a mix of both Jurassic and Cretaceous formations before. But obviously there's dinosaurs from all over the world. So some of the earliest come from Argentina, actually. Some of the biggest dinosaurs, those titanosaurs, those gigantic sauropods, come also from Patagonia. There's fossils that you can find of dinosaurs, especially those feathered ones in Asia, for example. So there's a lot of really amazing places around the world that yield these fossils.
How many teeth do Hadrosaurus have? That sounds like a Bill question.
Hundreds.
Okay.
Hundreds of teeth. Just, Leidy was extremely prescient in figuring out that Hadrosaurus had a dental battery. And what this consisted of was grooves in the jaws. He figured this out from just a piece of the maxillary, the upper jawbone, and the 9 teeth that he had at his disposal. The teeth were tightly packed together in rows so that maybe there would be 3 teeth in one row, and they were closely oppressed rows. And each jaw would have a series of these teeth. So the dinosaurs were constantly shedding their teeth because if they were eating pine cones, it took a bit of grinding for all that fiber. And what would happen is as one tooth fell out, then the tooth below it would replace it. But all the teeth were functional because of the fact that the jaws could give slightly. The bones of the skull, particularly in the facial part of the skull, are loosely joined in these hadrosaurian dinosaurs. And what could happen is that as the animal closed its jaws, the bones of the skull would move outward as the lower jaw moved up, and this would create a shearing surface for these hundreds of teeth. Wow. And that's how they could masticate their food, eating large volumes of vegetation. If you're a 35-foot-long hadrosaur and such things exist out west, you need a lot of plant food every single day. It's like hundreds of pounds of salad. So they had to have lots of teeth. And they're shedding them all the time.
Wow. Without the skull, how did the sculptor estimate what the head of Haddy looked like? Either one? Yeah, Grace?
Yeah, so the skull that if people were passing in that was on display was actually the original skull that was included in that mount in the mid-19th century. And so at the time, as we heard from the Crystal Palace iguanodons, for instance, there's this idea that dinosaurs were these scaly, lizard, slow animals. So when we didn't have the parts of them, we used, again, living relatives, or what we thought were living relatives. So the skull out there is actually based on the skull of an iguana, which we know is not right. So we've come a far way. So now we actually know relatives, right, of hadrosaurids that were very closely related to Hadrosaurus foulkii. So we use those skulls in the current model. So even though we only have the tiniest portion of the actual skull of Hadrosaurus foulkii, we can use closely living relative skulls to create our very updated and accurate models.
Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add to that, or?
Well, there was a reason. Basically, it was because of the similarity of the iguanodon teeth to iguana. So
yeah,
that was the reason why Waterhouse Hawkins used the iguana as his model.
Yeah. Now, this is a question for both of you. Why did you become a paleontologist? Do you want to start, Grace?
I do not beat the Jurassic Park allegations. I'm not going to lie. I still love those movies, even if I'm sitting there listening to Jonathan Bailey call a mosasaur and a Quetzalcoatlus a dinosaur. But, I mean, I loved it because I always loved science, and I always loved the discovery that paleontology offered. Just trying to understand these animals that were so successful for so long. I mean, our species has only been around for maybe 300,000 years. Dinosaurs were closer to 150. So these animals were so successful, and that really it's so cool to learn about how these animals lived, interacted with their environments, and what that can tell us about the animals that are alive today. And especially, I know Dr. Gallagher can probably talk a bit about the importance of looking at extinction events as well, especially currently when we are potentially in the midst of a sixth extinction.
What about you, Bill? What drew you to this field?
Fantasia.
How so?
That was easy, right? Yeah, the dinosaur sequence in Fantasia. I saw that when I was 7, and then I wanted to know more about dinosaurs, and I got a bunch of Christmas books, dinosaur books for Christmas. And on my 8th birthday, I became a member of the Academy of Natural Sciences. And then I went on every field trip, attended every meeting, hung around the halls on the weekend, and made a pest out of myself until they gave me a job.
That's the way to do it. Did Hadrosaurus and other dinosaur species migrate like modern birds do? Do we know anything about that? Did they change locations?
Yeah, I know at least that there is some strong evidence that there was some migratory patterns in at least some individuals. I know a study that was done specifically, I know about sauropods, looking at the gastroliths. So in some of these individuals, they would actually, like modern birds, like eat stones and use that to ferment. And this is definitely not something that you would potentially see in something like Hadrosaurus, because they were actually able to chew their food. These big sauropods would just take a big gulp of trees and just swallow that whole, and needed these ways to ferment. They were definitely not doing any chewing. And so people have looked at the stones, right, that you find at different sites, and have found that those rocks come from different areas. So trying to track the sort of rocks that have shifted from one area to another as evidence of that there are migratory patterns. And we know for sure that these animals all were living in these large groups and going to these nesting grounds yearly.
How long did it take to dig up and preserve and display Haddy?
Well, essentially, most of the digging was done in late September and through the month of October, so a little over a month. And it was done very methodically. Haddy came over, from Philadelphia and directed the dig operations after William Parker Folk and his marl diggers came across the bones. And he mapped out the way the bones were laid out. They sieved the marl, they let it dry and sieved it, and this produced more smaller bones and teeth and more fragments of bones. So essentially it was maybe, 5 weeks at the most. Then they wrapped the bones in cloth and put them in a cart with a thick bed of straw on the bottom to cushion the bones as they went along in the cart. And they were transported over here to, first to the University of Pennsylvania, I believe, and eventually they wound up at the Academy. And this is where Haddy described and named the dinosaur in the December of 1858. So the whole process there took just a couple months.
And this is another question we got. What was the reaction like to the mound? I mean, it was a absolutely phenomenal attraction, right? And people came from all over to see it. What was the hot goss, so to speak, when it first went up?
The reports are that it was the first wave of dinomania, that there were lines around the block to get in to see this thing, and scientists came from all over North America, and maybe even some European visitors came to see it, because it was the only dinosaur skeleton in the world. The first one and the only one. Hadrosaurus was one of the most complete dinosaurs. That's why T.H. Huxley used it as part of his argument that birds were descended from dinosaurs. Of course, there was Archaeopteryx by that time as well, which is an even more convincing missing link type dinosaur bird. But, you know, I think one of the take-home messages here is that American science really came to the fore with the discovery of Hadrosaurus and then with the discoveries in the American West as a result of the bone wars between Cope and Marsh. That's when dinosaur knowledge exploded, and American science finally was accepted by the European scientists. Going back to the time of Jefferson, the learned savants of Europe looked down their nose at the animals of North America. Nothing in North America could equal the majesty of the elephant or the rhinoceros or the camel or the giraffe. America was depauperate. It didn't have great animals like that. But when giant sauropod bones started coming out from the American West, well, that attitude began to change because we demonstrably had, at least in the geologic past, a much, much larger fauna of great animals. And in fact, more recently, we had the Ice Age mammals, mammoths and mastodons. And Jefferson instructed Lewis and Clark to look for living mammoths because he wanted to show the Europeans that the Americans had animals just as good as theirs. But really, the developments in geology and paleontology, largely driven by the Academy and the people at Penn in the later part of the 19th century, brought American science to the fore. The Europeans couldn't look down their nose anymore.
And
This is an
a lot of-
underappreciated aspect of it.
And a lot of that actually started here at the Academy with all these firsts, not only with Hadrosaurus foulkii, but with, say, Elasmosaurus, is the holotype is here. We have the Dryptosaurus holotype, which was that claw that came out, and that was actually Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, the first drawing of a very active dinosaur. So it's a very famous painting where it's two Dryptosaurus that are sort of jumping at each other, one's like jumping on them, and that was revolutionary for the time because it showed that dinosaurs were active and not these like slow-blooded creatures. There's so many firsts and historic specimens. We have some of the first dinosaur teeth from the West that Leidy described. We have some of Thomas Jefferson's fossil collection here as well. So it's a really amazing place for a lot of these firsts in science that I don't think a lot of people know about.
Well, we have to wrap up, but I do want to fit in a last question, which is, what advice do you have for aspiring paleontologists? Grace, do you want to start?
Stay curious, and as I think you've heard, and I was a bit of the same, I grew up going to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum and looking at the people who were actually preparing the fossils and doing the research, and from day one I was fascinated with it. And that was how I got my start. Is I had an internship position when I was in college at their prep lab, and I just kept going back and saying, what else you got for me? And from there I made connections with other paleontologists, and eventually came here for my PhD and have gone on digs all over the West. And so really, if you're interested in this subject, reach out to as many people as you can who are in the field, because it is a relatively small field when you think about a lot of others, and people are very willing to talk and hear your research and try and get you involved. There's the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting for anyone who's maybe of more like high school or college level is a great one to go and meet people and see what the current research is. So yeah, that's a great starting point.
And how about you, Bill?
Well, I'd recommend reading a lot. That's one good thing to do. I have a hard time motivating my students to read, but reading is the key to success. I think if you look at most successful people in any field, they're readers. And so you're going to have to read a lot if you go into this. It's like Grace was saying, you got to like to read those papers. But it starts out with the books, and by the way, here's a really good one.
Very good, very good. All
Highly
right.
recommend it. Available on Amazon.
Amazing. So last question. What is your favorite dinosaur totally unfair question, but you can only name one. Ooh,
Do I give my reasoning too?
maybe.
Diplodocus?
Mm-hmm.
I see some sauropod shirts out there. Yep.
Some Diplo fans.
Because a lot of my research is based on Diplodocus specifically. I was looking at pathologies actually because they've got these really cool tails that are 80 plus long vertebrae. We
Wow.
don't see that in like pretty much anything that's ever lived to that scale. And there's been a lot of studies looking at why we see a lot of pathology, so like injuries and disease in their tails too. So I just feel like it's such a cool combination of these huge animals that we don't have anything to that scale today.
And what about you?
Dryptosaurus, hands down. Our own native New Jersey Tyrannosauroid, the animal whose announcement and description prompted Marsh to get Cope to show him around the fossil fields and touched off the bone wars.
Right.
But the animal itself is just fascinating. In his 1866 description of Dryptosaurus, Cope is very prescient and advanced in his views of this dinosaur as an extremely active, jumping, leaping dinosaur. And that's how he had Charles R. Knight depict him in a famous mural of Dryptosaurus, which was overseen by Cope on his deathbed here in Philadelphia in 1895. And that animal had the big claw that I showed you, but the bones are very gracile and they're hollow inside. And one of the ways in which Cope foresaw where paleontology would be going is, in his description, he points out point after point after point of bird-like affinities in Dryptosaurus. If you read it closely, it says, and this is like the birds. And he gives it the name Dryptosaurus, Lalaps is the first name he gave it. Aquilunguis, which means eagle claw. He was impressed with its agility and its bird-like qualities. And that is really not a image of the dinosaur that comes into popular perception until the Jurassic Park movies.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So it stands at the beginnings of the dawning of the realization these are not just lumbering, four-legged, dim-witted, slow metabolism lizards.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for being here and for all of your knowledge. And Molly, do you want to have closing words?
Yeah, we want to thank you all again for coming. Thanks for all these wonderful people here tonight. And I wanted to let you guys know that every Saturday and Sunday at 11 a.m. we do a Haddy tour right over around the corner. So that's another reason to come back. And also in February, we're doing the next town square with Maiken. We're talking about tending the tree canopy, and it's in February 5th, and we'll send out some information. So great to have you all here tonight. Thank you so much.